I signed the papers myself. That's the part nobody wants to sit with. Not her, not a notary who was in on it, not some forger in a back room. Me. I picked up the pen and I signed my name to documents that transferred 40 years of my life out of my hands and into hers. And I did it because I thought I was being smart. That's the cruelest part of this whole thing. I wasn't being romantic. I wasn't being naive about love. I thought I was being a sharp businessman making a sound financial decision, and that belief, that specific confidence, is exactly what she needed me to have. My name is Everett Stone. I'm 68 years old. I built a commercial printing and logistics company in Boston over 4 decades, starting with one machine in a rented garage in Dorchester in 1984 and ending, before all of this, with a regional operation that employed 61 people and turned a consistent profit for 32 of its 40 years. I am not a man who made reckless decisions. I am not a man who signed things he hadn't read. I built that company contract by contract, dispute by dispute, year by year, and the caution that kept it alive for 4 decades is the same caution I believed I was exercising when I met Crystal Mendoza. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because the version of this story that's easiest to tell, the one where a foolish old man got taken in by a pretty face, is not the whole truth. It is not even mostly the truth. What happened to me was sophisticated, it was patient, and it was specifically designed for someone exactly like me. I came to the Philippines in early 2022, not for romance. I came because I had been exploring the possibility of expanding my logistics operation into Southeast Asia, and because a business contact of mine, a man named Franklin Briggs, who runs an import operation out of Cebu, had told me that the Philippines was underserved in regional commercial printing and that the cost advantages were significant. Franklin is a careful man and a good businessman, and I trusted his read. I booked 3 weeks in Manila, then Cebu, with the intention of doing market research and meeting with a few local operators. I was not looking for anything else. My divorce from my wife Patricia had been finalized 2 years earlier, after 31 years, and I had made a private decision that I was done with that part of my life. I had the company. I had my apartment in Back Bay. I had enough to keep me occupied without adding emotional complexity to the mix. Or so I thought. I met Crystal Mendoza on my 4th day in Manila. I was having lunch at a business hotel near the BGC district, the kind of place where the air conditioning is aggressive and the clientele is mostly corporate, and she was sitting 2 tables away, working through what looked like a dense stack of financial documents. She was dressed professionally, conservatively, not in any way that called attention to herself. When the waiter brought my food to her table by mistake, and she flagged him down to correct the error, we made eye contact and she smiled and said, "Wrong table, but same order, good taste." That was it. That was the whole of our first exchange. I laughed and we went back to our respective lunches, and I thought nothing of it. She came over when she was leaving. About 20 minutes later, "I noticed you were reading the BGC commercial zoning report," she said, nodding at the documents I had spread across the table. "Most people use that as a sleep aid. Are you looking at the area for business?" I told her yes, in general terms. She handed me a business card, Crystal Mendoza, business consultant, with a firm name I didn't recognize, but that sounded legitimate, Meridian Pacific Advisory Group. "If you're looking at operational setup in the Philippines, I work with foreign investors doing exactly that," she said. "Feel free to reach out if it would be helpful." And she left. No pressure, no lingering, no performance. Just a card and a clean exit. I looked up Meridian Pacific Advisory Group that evening. The website was professional bios, service listings, a client testimonials page, case studies. Crystal's bio listed a degree from De La Salle University and a postgraduate qualification in corporate finance from a Singapore institution. I searched her name and found a few LinkedIn connections with people in Manila's business community, some comments on industry forums, a mention in a local business publication from a few years earlier. Nothing alarming, nothing that made me pause. She looked, from every surface I could check, like exactly what her card said she was. I emailed her the next morning and we met for coffee 2 days later. That first proper meeting was entirely professional. She asked about my business. about what I was exploring in the Philippines, about my current corporate structure. She listened carefully and asked good questions, not flashy questions designed to impress, but the kind of quiet, clarifying questions that someone asks when they actually understand what they're hearing. She knew the difference between an S-corp and a corp. She knew what a distribution agreement looked like. She asked about my tax situation in Massachusetts with a specificity that I found reassuring, because it told me she understood that American business owners operating abroad face a particular set of structural questions that a generic consultant wouldn't know to ask. I was impressed. I told myself I was being careful, and that careful had led me here, to a qualified professional, and that was what due diligence looked like. We met 4 more times over the following 2 weeks, always professional, always about the business. She walked me through the basic framework of how a foreign national could establish a legitimate business presence in the Philippines, what structures were available, what the tax implications were on both ends. She mentioned, somewhere around the 3rd meeting, that some of her clients who had existing U.S. operations found it advantageous for liability and tax purposes to create a holding structure that separated their international assets from their domestic ones. She wasn't pushing it. She brought it up the way you bring up an option, something to consider, not something to decide on the spot. It's not right for everyone, she said. But for someone with an established company and an interest in regional expansion, it can simplify things considerably. I did not make any decisions during those 2 weeks. I flew home to Boston at the end of March and spent 6 weeks thinking about it. I called my accountant, a man named Douglas, and yes, I told him about Crystal's suggestion. He said the general concept of a holding structure for international assets was legitimate and not unusual. He said he didn't know Philippine corporate law specifically and that I would need someone on the ground there. He said, if I was going to pursue it, to make sure the Philippine attorney was independent of the consultant. I noted that. I told myself I would follow it. I flew back to Manila in May. I told myself it was for the market research, which was still genuinely ongoing. I met with Crystal again. She had prepared, without my asking, a preliminary analysis of how a restructure might work for my specific situation, pulling from the details I had shared in our earlier meetings. It was a 12-page document, formatted, footnoted, professionally presented. I read it twice. The logic was sound. The projected tax advantages were significant. She estimated a reduction in effective international tax exposure of between 18 and 22% on any Philippine-based revenue, with secondary benefits to the domestic structure through a properly executed holding arrangement. These were not outlandish numbers. They were credible numbers, the kind that a real restructuring might actually produce. I also noticed, somewhere around the 2nd meeting of that May trip, that I had started to look forward to seeing Crystal in a way that was not entirely professional. I want to be honest about that because it matters to the story. She was 41 years old, 27 years younger than me, and she was not overtly flirtatious, not in any obvious way. But there was a warmth in how she treated me that went a degree or two beyond consultant and client. She remembered small things. When I mentioned offhand during our 2nd meeting that I preferred my coffee without sugar, it arrived without sugar at every subsequent meeting without my having to say it. When I referenced, once, that my son Derek and I had a strained relationship, she didn't pry, but the next time she saw me, she asked, very gently, "How are things with your son?" It was nothing. It was everything. It was the kind of attentiveness that a lonely 68-year-old man who had spent 2 years in a quiet apartment in Back Bay notices and notices and notices until he starts making room for it in how he thinks about his days. I did not pursue anything romantic with Crystal. I want to be clear about that. There was no relationship, no intimacy, nothing I could point to and say this is where professional became personal. What there was, instead, was something more insidious, a slow recalibration of how much I trusted her, driven not by anything she did wrong, but by the accumulation of small things she did right. She was professional and warm and smart and attentive, and over time those qualities stopped being evidence I was evaluating and became the water I was swimming in. I stopped checking. I stopped questioning. She had simply become In my mind, a trustworthy person and trustworthy people don't get cross-examined every time they offer advice. In July of 2022, she introduced me to a Philippine attorney named Rodrigo Canas, who she described as the legal partner she used for corporate restructuring work. Rodrigo was in his 50s, soft-spoken, formal in the way of someone who had been a practicing lawyer for a long time. He explained, in careful detail, the mechanics of what a share transfer to a holding company would involve. The holding company, which Crystal's firm would help establish, would be incorporated in the Philippines, with me as the primary beneficial owner. My existing company shares, which represented ownership of Stone Logistics and Print Incorporated, would be partially transferred to the holding entity, creating a structure that, on paper, separated the international-facing elements of my business from the domestic core. The tax advantages would flow from this separation. The shares transferred would have a book value of approximately $505,000 based on my most recent company valuation. I asked who would be the registered director of the Philippine holding company. Rodrigo said it would need to be a Philippine national for regulatory compliance. This was accurate, by the way. It is a real requirement for certain Philippine corporate structures, and that Crystal, as the administering consultant, would serve in that capacity temporarily while the structure was established. Once the structure was operational, we could bring in a nominee director if I preferred, or I could remain as beneficial owner with Crystal as nominal director. He framed it as a standard arrangement, common practice, nothing to be concerned about. I asked how long temporarily meant. He said typically 6 to 12 months while the structure was being registered and optimized. I asked to take the documents home. I had them for 3 weeks. I read them myself, and then, this is the decision I will regret for the rest of my life. I did not take them to an independent attorney. I took them back to Crystal and asked her to walk me through the sections I had questions about. She answered every question clearly. She never pressured me. She never said anything that should have alarmed me. She just answered my questions calmly and completely, and I accepted her answers because she had been answering my questions for 6 months and she had never once been wrong about anything I could verify. I had stopped running independent checks. I had started using her as the reference I used to check herself against, and I didn't even notice I was doing it. I signed the share transfer documents on August 14, 2022. There was a notary present. Rodrigo was present. Crystal was present. I initialed 12 pages and signed 4 signature blocks, and it took about 40 minutes, and then we shook hands, and Crystal said, "This is the right move, Everett. You'll see the benefits start to show in the first filing period." I flew home to Boston the following week feeling like a man who had made a shrewd decision. I called my accountant Douglas and told him it was done. He said he'd want to see the documentation when it came through. I told him it would be a few months while the holding structure was being registered. He said fine. I went back to running my business. The first sign that something was wrong came in November. I emailed Crystal asking for a status update on the holding company registration, and she replied promptly. She always replied promptly, saying it was progressing. There had been some delays at the regulatory level, typical for these kinds of structures. Nothing to worry about. I accepted that. In January of 2023, I emailed again. Same answer, same warmth, same reassurance. In March, I called instead of emailing, and she picked up and said she was just about to contact me. There had been a development, a change in the processing timeline, still moving forward. I asked for a written update, and she sent one the next day. 2 paragraphs, professional language, no specifics that I could verify. In April, I called Douglas and told him the timeline was running longer than expected. He asked me to send him the original transfer documents. I did. He called me back 4 hours later with a tone in his voice I had not heard from him before, quiet and very careful, the way a person speaks when they are trying not to alarm you before they are sure. "Everett," he said, "these documents don't establish you as beneficial owner. They transfer the shares, outright, to Crystal Mendoza as an individual, with no trust structure or beneficial ownership clause." I told him that couldn't be right, that the arrangement was a holding company structure. He said, "There's no holding company mentioned in these documents. The transfer is direct. Her name is on them. Your shares are in her name. I sat in my office in Boston for a very long time after that call. I looked at the documents again, the ones I had read and initialed and signed, and I saw, with the horrible clarity of a man whose assumptions have just been removed, what I had missed. The language that I had understood to describe a holding company structure was vague in precisely the places that vagueness served her. The nominee-director arrangement I thought I was agreeing to was, in the actual language of the document, an outright transfer of registered ownership. The beneficial owner protections I believed were present were not there. I had asked Crystal about beneficial ownership during our walkthrough of the documents, and she had explained it in a way that I now understood. She had explained it in a way that let me hear what I wanted to hear without actually saying the thing I wanted her to say. It was precise deception dressed in the language of clarification. I called Crystal immediately. She picked up. I told her what Douglas had found. There was a pause, not a long one, not guilty or flustered, just a pause, the kind a person takes when they are deciding which version of calm to use. Then she said, "Everett, I think there may be a misunderstanding about how Philippine corporate law works. The way the documents read in isolation can seem different from how they function within the full regulatory framework. Let me have Rodrigo reach out to your accountant and walk him through the structure." I said I would like that. Rodrigo never called. I emailed Crystal twice more that week. She replied once, briefly, saying she was coordinating with Rodrigo and would be in touch. After that, her replies came slower, shorter. By the third week of April, they stopped altogether. I hired a Philippine attorney independently, this time through a referral from the U.S. Embassy in Manila, a woman named Patricia Alcantara who practices corporate law in Makati. She reviewed the transfer documents within 48 hours and called me with the same assessment Douglas had given me, but with an additional layer of information that made it worse. The shares had already been used. Crystal, as registered owner, had submitted a dividend declaration to my company's Philippine registered entity, a subsidiary I had established legitimately 2 years earlier as part of my early expansion research, and had extracted $67,000 in dividend distributions in the 3 months since the transfer was finalized. The paperwork was, as Patricia described it, clean and legally compliant. Everything Crystal had done with the shares was, on paper, within her rights as the registered owner. Because she was the registered owner, because I had signed a document making her so. Patricia told me that contesting the transfer would require proving that the documents had been signed under fraudulent misrepresentation, a viable legal theory, she said, but difficult in practice because I had been given the documents to review, had taken time with them, had asked questions, and had signed them without independent legal counsel. The fact that you relied on the consultant to explain the documents you were signing her, Patricia said, measured and careful, will complicate the claim. She paused. It doesn't make it impossible, but it will be an extended process. I flew to Manila in May of 2023, not because I expected a confrontation to change anything, because I needed to look at the situation directly rather than from 8,000 miles away, which is something I have always believed, that you cannot manage a problem you refuse to stand in front of. I met with Patricia in her office for 2 hours. Then I went to the address for Meridian Pacific Advisory Group that had been on Crystal's business card. The office existed. It was occupied by a different firm. The receptionist told me Meridian Pacific had vacated their space in February, 6 months after I had signed the documents. I asked if she knew where they had relocated. She did not. I asked Patricia later that day to check the corporate registry for Meridian Pacific Advisory Group. She came back to me the following morning. The firm had been dissolved in January of 2023, 5 months after my signature. I tried to reach Rodrigo Canas. The phone number I had for him was disconnected. Patricia searched the Philippine bar registry and found a Rodrigo Canas who had been a licensed attorney past tense. His license had been suspended 18 months earlier for unrelated professional misconduct. The man I had taken legal guidance from, whose professional credentials I had assumed Crystal had verified because she presented him as her legal partner, had not been a practicing attorney at the time. He sat across from me and explained the documents I was about to sign. The legal process is ongoing. Patricia has filed a complaint with the Philippine SEC and a civil case for fraudulent misrepresentation. My Boston attorneys have filed supplementary documentation with U.S. authorities regarding the cross-border nature of the fraud. None of this has produced anything recoverable yet. The shares remain in Crystal's name. The $67,000 in dividends she extracted is gone. The total value of the shares transferred $505,000 as of the August 2022. Valuation represents my ownership stake in a company I built for 40 years, and that stake is now, legally and practically, hers. My Boston attorneys tell me the domestic legal question whether the fraudulent transfer can be unwound under U.S. law, given that the underlying company is American, is complicated and may take years to resolve. Patricia tells me the Philippine case faces the same challenges she described from the beginning. I told my son Derek in June of 2023. We had not spoken at length in over 2 years. Our relationship had broken down gradually after the divorce, in the way that some father-son relationships do when a marriage ends and both people are too proud and too hurt to be the one who reaches across the silence first. I called him and told him the whole thing, start to finish, and when I finished there was a long quiet on the line, and then he said, "Dad, why didn't you have someone look at those documents independently?" And I said, "Because I trusted her." And he said, "You trusted a stranger with 40 years of your company." And I said, "Yes, not defensively, just plainly, because it was true and defending it would have required lying, and Derek had earned the truth even if it was ugly." He flew to Boston the following week. He spent 3 days there, going through the documentation with me and my attorneys, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask, pushing on timelines and details with the focused intensity of someone who has decided to be useful rather than angry. He is 39 years old and works in technology and understands nothing about commercial printing or logistics, but he understands legal documents and he understands how to ask the right questions of the right people, and those 3 days were the closest we had been in years. It took losing the company I built to rebuild something with my son. I don't know what to make of that. I'm still not sure I can make anything of it. My friend Franklin Briggs, the man whose recommendation had brought me to Manila in the first place, called me when he heard what had happened through a mutual contact. He said, "Everett, I am so sorry. I feel responsible for putting you in that situation." I told him he wasn't responsible. He had told me the Philippines was a good market. He had not told me to trust a business consultant without independent verification, because that was not something he had expected to need to say. I do not blame Franklin. I do not even fully blame myself, which I know sounds strange given everything I've just told you. I blame the gap, the specific, targeted gap between what I knew how to protect myself from and what she knew how to slide through without triggering any of it. Because here is the thing about Crystal Mendoza that I have had 1.5 years to think about. She did not beat me with emotion. She did not make me fall in love with her. She did not use loneliness or grief or romantic feeling as her instrument, the way these stories usually go. She beat me professionally. She found the version of my pride that lived in my business identity, the part that said I am a sharp man, I understand finance, I know how to structure a deal, and she used that pride as the door. She showed me a complicated structure and let me believe I was smart enough to evaluate it, knowing that I would evaluate it using tools she had provided and ask questions of the person who had built the trap. She turned my own competence against me. She made my strength the mechanism of my loss. I sit with that differently than I would sit with having been emotionally deceived. If she had made me fall in love with her and then robbed me, I could attribute some of it to the particular vulnerability of grief and loneliness, could give myself the grace that we generally give people who get hurt in love. But this was not that. This was a business transaction, conducted with business logic, and I failed at it in a domain where I had spent 40 years being good. That is a different kind of wound. It doesn't have the softness that heartbreak sometimes carries. It is just a clean, hard loss, and the full weight of it lands on my professional judgment. The thing I was most certain was still intact. My company is not gone in the practical sense. Stone Logistics and Print Incorporated still operates. My employees still have jobs. The daily running of the business continued while all of this unfolded, because the business has a management structure that doesn't require my daily presence. What is gone is my ownership stake, my 40-year equity position, the shares that represented not just financial value but the accumulated record of every decision I made and every risk I took and every year I showed up and kept the thing running. Crystal Mendoza is now, on paper, a significant stakeholder in a company she has never set foot in, whose employees she has never met, whose 40-year history she has never been part of. My attorneys are working to unwind it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Either way, I am 68 years old, and the resolution, if it comes, will come in courtrooms and on timelines that do not particularly care about my age. I went back to Manila in October of 2023. Not for the legal process. Patricia handles that from here. I went because I had a piece of unfinished thinking I could only complete by standing in the place where it started. I went to the hotel near BGC where Crystal and I had first spoken. I sat at the same table, or close enough to the same table, and had lunch. The waiter did not bring my food to the wrong table. Nobody approached me with a business card. It was just lunch in an air-conditioned hotel restaurant in a city I had come to with genuine ambition and left with a wound that is still not finished bleeding. I thought about the moment I signed the documents. I try not to revisit it compulsively, but in that restaurant, I let myself go back to it fully. August 14th, 2022, the notary's table. Crystal sitting across from me, calm and professional. Rodrigo, with his expired law license, explaining pages. I should have had a different attorney explain, the pen in my hand. The specific, clear-eyed confidence I felt in that moment, not the confidence of a man being deceived, but the confidence of a man who believed he had done his homework. I keep trying to find the moment where I could have stopped it, where I should have stopped it. The answer, every time, is the same. I should have hired an independent attorney to review the documents before I signed them. That is it. That one step. I did not take it because Crystal had become, through 6 months of patience and competence and small attentiveness, the person I trusted to check her own work. And that is the only mistake that mattered, not all the smaller ones, not the email I didn't send or the question I didn't ask, but that one structural failure. I let the person with the most to gain from my signature become the person I trusted most to tell me whether signing was safe. If you are a business owner, retired or active, and someone offers to help you restructure for tax efficiency, hear me clearly. The credentials on the card are not the verification. The professional website is not the verification. The fact that they know the right language is not the verification. Get your own attorney, not the attorney they recommend, not the attorney they introduce you to. Your own attorney, found independently, who has no relationship with the person proposing the deal and no financial interest in whether you sign. I spent 40 years building something and 6 months dismantling it because I skipped one step that would have cost me a few $1,000s in a week of patience. A few $1,000s and 1 week. Against 40 years and $500,000. That arithmetic is something I live with every day. Derek called me last week. Not about the case, just to call. We talked for about an hour about nothing important, the way people do when they have remembered how to talk to each other. He asked how I was sleeping. I told him better than before. He said that was good. Before he hung up, he said, "Dad, I'm glad you told me." I said I was glad too, and I meant it. Not because it changed anything about the money or the shares or the years of work that are currently sitting in someone else's name in a legal system 8,000 miles away, but because some doors only open when everything else falls away, and Derek and I had needed a door for a long time, and apparently this was the one that finally opened it. I don't have any poetry for that. It's just true, and true is the only thing I know how to offer anymore. The case continues. I continue. At 68, continuing is mostly what there is to do.